do today is we're going to cover some of the material from chapter 11, and I may get it on Thursday. I may get into chapter 12 a bit. I know that the syllabus has us really sort of getting into chapter 12 next week, and so that may be the case. I am not really feeling like it's important to be totally bound to the schedule, in terms of what chapters we cover when, other than the fact that I probably am not going to add any chapters. And so it's not like I'm going to, when I say I'm not bound, it's not like I'm going to sort of add a bunch of new stuff here toward the end. That's not going to happen. All I'm simply saying is we're going to keep the same exam schedule and whatnot. And I say this particularly because what's going on in chapter 12 is discussion of what's called Keynesian theory. It's based on the work of the economist John Maynard Keynes. And we're going to sort of get into that a bit in chapter 11. And chapter 11 sort of opens the door to some of that. But before I get too deeply into chapter 12, though, I'll sort of make a transition into that from appendix B in the text, which I didn't assign as a reading because it's deep of reading. It's, in my mind, it may be a little bit beyond the scope of this course in terms of how some of the content is presented. So, I can't tell you not to read something, but in terms of required reading, it's not going to be necessary in order to, understand the content for the exam. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to cover chapter 11 today, which is going to deal with economic model building. And as I mentioned in my preview note in Brightspace, we're going to start to build some economic models, which are very useful in economics. And up until this point, the only models we've really dealt with are, we've dealt with some. We've dealt with the production possibilities model. We've dealt with the circular flow model and the model of demand and supply. And that's really it so far, but we're going to sort of now build the beginnings of macro using these tools throughout the rest of this course, probably every class session throughout the rest of the course. So I'll get into that in a second. Before I do that, though, I just want to talk about the exam that was last week. If anybody did not take the exam, anybody who's watching live or is watching on the recording, if for whatever reason, we had a number of people who, for whatever reason, did not take the exam. And if you want to do it, you've still got the chance to do it as a makeup. So you've got this week, basically, I sort of allow students to do it as a makeup. And then after this makeup period, this week is over, I can make the results available for everybody to see the questions they got right, got wrong, etc. So get with me if that's the case. Now, obviously, you could drop the lowest exam. So sometimes people will drop an exam for whatever reason, not ready, whatever. I sort of encourage everybody to take every exam because there's no disadvantage in not doing that. There may be a disadvantage in not doing it, however, if you have two exams, quite as well. So, anyway, so get with me if that's the case, and we'll sort of work with it, okay, from there. Okay, so we're going to talk about model building, particularly aggregate demand and aggregate supply today. Before I do that, I want to sort of build up to it because one of the things that I have noticed, and we've used this OpenStax, this free textbook now for a bit of time, and I think we're pretty happy with it for the most part. There is one area that I think is sort of glaringly missing, and that's the whole idea of all the content leading up to what we call the multiplier. And there is not one single multiplier, but multipliers are something that comes up again and again in macro. And we're only really going to talk about two multipliers in this course. One we're going to get to this morning, dealing with the consumption multiplier, and then we'll talk about a money multiplier a bit later in the course. But what a multiplier is, it simply takes some effect in the economy and magnifies it. In other words, it multiplies it because of successive iterations and transactions through the economy. So that's really what a multiplier is. But to do that, though, we need to sort of build up to that and talk a bit about consumption and savings. And so let's do this here. Let's talk a bit about, and I'm going to sort of swivel the camera here for the best I can. And so I've got on the board here, if you didn't see this behind me. So that's sort of the plan for today. So I'm going to sort of swivel the camera. We're going to talk a bit about consumption and savings. And so first of all, what we've got is this. We've got two functions that are complementary to one another, and that's the consumption function and the savings function. So they're mathematical complements. And let's talk a bit about how we get to that, okay? So this is an important thing for us to discuss. And if we go back to the income approach to GDP, you might remember that we had two different approaches. One was the expenditures approach of Y equals C plus I plus G plus or minus net exports. And that was the demand side of the economy. And we have the supply side of the economy, which is called the income approach, which starts with GDP or Y, and it leads, and we sort of drops down to national income, and it drops down to personal income, and we've got government taking a piece of the action. We've got all kinds of categories here. And I mentioned in class that when I went over this, I was cutting out quite a lot. This is why I showed you a really nasty site from the BEA website to show you that there are a lot of categories in there. And then we take out of that personal taxes. And I know you've got this in your notes somewhere, but and we end up with disposable income. Okay. That's sort of the bottom line when we talk about sort of slicing and dicing the share of the economy that's earned as income. That is, if somebody's doing the demanding on the expenditure side, somebody's doing the receiving on the supply side. And then this is all the suppliers of goods who receive income, even government and government here, because they don't supply it's not a quid pro quo transaction. I don't pay for the police to come if I have an emergency, or the fire department or whatever. I don't pay the FBI or the DEA or whatever, but I do pay taxes. So it's not exactly the arm's length kind of transactions that we see with businesses and with labor, but nonetheless, they do receive a share of the economy in the form of taxes. And so we've sort of divvied up, corporate taxes, personal taxes and whatnot to arrive at disposable income. And out of disposable income, there are only two things that consumers can do with that, households can do with that, and it's spend it or save it. Okay, spend it or save it. Those are the only two things that households can do with it. And it's important to remember this because even if you think about it, I think we mentioned this in class, and I know sometimes the question arises, what about things like charitable giving or whatever? I mean, does that translate to consumption savings? We say it translates to consumption because it doesn't necessarily match the definition that we gave of savings. And the savings definition that we gave, and I know I'm reviewing a little bit here, but I sort of sometimes think it's important to kind of go backwards in order to go forward. But we said that there are two main characteristics of savings based on our definition here. And that's number one, savings is what we call deferred consumption. That is, we are deferring the spending of it for some time until sometime in the future. When that future time will be, who knows, right? And it could be that someone will never spend that. And they'll live their entire lives, they'll pass it on to some other person. And maybe at some point they'll spend it, maybe they'll save it. It doesn't really make any difference. It's still deferred until it does become some sort of consumption activity. And then one important thing that we're going to sort of elaborate a bit more later on is this idea of being deposited with financial intermediaries. And so here, I want to reiterate something I talked about before, back when we did this GDP chapter, was that when we talk about financial intermediaries as being recipients of savings, it's not just, the word savings sort of suggests we're talking about banks and savings accounts, and it would definitely include that, but it's more than that because we take a broader definition, a more comprehensive definition, and say that investments in any kind of financial instrument at all, whether it's savings, checking, or deposit accounts, or things like mutual funds, or investment accounts, stocks, bonds, all kinds of instruments, those would all qualify as being part of the financial intermediary world. We're going to talk a bit more about finance a bit later in the course. I think it comes up around chapter 10, or not chapter 10, something a bit later in, because we're already past chapter 10. It comes up a bit later. I don't know the exact chapter, but we'll get to that. We'll talk about how this is sort of a more comprehensive definition than simply banks, even though I will say this, the banks are really the most important piece of this. And we'll talk about what they're about. Okay. So we are saying these are mathematical complements. So if all disposable income is channeling the consumption or savings, then we can simply look at this sort of analysis here. That if we have disposable income, let's just say the average household's disposable income in the US is around 40,000 right now, okay? Something like that. And if in fact you've got a certain amount that's going to consumption, let's say 30,000 goes to consumption, remember taxes are paid for, then savings must be what? 10,000 must be 10,000, has to be, right? In other words, they have to, the one has to equal the other. So 30,000 plus 10,000 must equal 40,000. Okay, so in other words, if you take 100% of disposable income in and 75% is consumed, then it must mean that 25% is channeled towards savings. Now, what about if you have disposable income of 40,000 and you spend 50,000, right? And what do we have here? Well, we must have a negative $10,000, right? So now we've got 125%, right? 125%, and we've got negative 25% in order for us to get back to the 100% here. And is it possible to have negative savings? And it is. It's very definitely possible. In fact, negative savings is what we refer to as dis savings. And it is very possible to have negative savings. So what about negative savings and what does it got? It sounds like it's maybe something wrong. It's something, I don't know. I think sometimes people view it as being maybe a financial weakness or a mismanagement. And I don't really think that's necessarily the case at all. I mean, what if you had a much higher income, say your income was 200,000 in disposable income, and you bought a house and you borrowed $500,000 for it? I don't think anybody would say, well, you're acting irresponsibly. And so as a result, this idea is that you can simply borrow more in order to achieve that. So dis savings is essentially negative savings. What does that mean? It means that it's really funded by a number of different means here, which means that we can arrive at dis savings. So how is dis savings funded? Well, number one, the most obvious way is drawing upon existing savings. Okay. So if somebody spends more in a year or period, whatever kind of period is, a year, a month, whatever, and which is not uncommon that people spend more than what the income is from that particular time period, then you can draw upon existing savings. That's one way to do it. Okay. Not a particularly difficult thing at all to know. Or secondly, which is very much related to this, although it doesn't seem like it's related, but it is, and simply the act of borrowing. So the act of borrowing. And when we talk about borrowing, oftentimes we're thinking of banks or lenders and sort of institutional lenders, financial intermediaries that are engaged in the business of lending money, mortgage companies, credit card companies, and whatnot. And so what are you really doing? Every time you borrow, you're simply taking someone else's, you're simply acquiring someone else's savings to use for your own consumption, right? Or for whatever purpose you're using it for. Even if you're borrowing from, say, a family member or a friend or whatnot, you're really borrowing from an amount that they are deferring consumption on in order to lend to you. Whether there's interest involved or not is mostly irrelevant when it comes to interpersonal transfer. If it's in the business realm where it's an arm's length transaction where we don't know each other, yes, there's definitely going to be interest involved. We're going to talk much more about interest as we get going throughout the class. But borrowing is simply an act of drawing upon someone's savings. This sort of implies that you're drawing against your own savings, in number one. Number two, it implies you're drawing against someone else's savings. And so every act of borrowing is an act of drawing upon someone else's savings. So the perennial question is, okay, well, is it more important to borrow or to save? And it's really sort of a false choice, because I know that for a long time in the economy, we had, people would talk about the value of savings and how savings had all this virtue. And the idea was that the more you save, the more you channel into investment. So, the idea is that businesses use that savings. Commercial banks, which, by the way, the banks that we know, the biggest banks in the country, some of the banks that we see around town, Bank of America, US Bank, Wells Fargo, those are officially called commercial banks because their initial purpose back before the Great Depression was to serve mostly business customers, hence the name commercial banks. Most ordinary individuals, they really weren't interested in dealing with them, which is why I think bankers probably got a bad reputation from the word go, and they haven't done very much to improve their reputation. Take it from me, because I used to work in that industry. But the idea is that they would lend to businesses. And the idea is that savings had this inherent virtue because it could be used to channel into business borrowing to create the I in the expenditures approach, that is capital investment, which allows the economy to grow and all that. And all that is true. Nothing is wrong, but it's sort of incomplete because it suggests that savings is inherently virtuous and borrowing is not. But we make the case that borrowing is an okay thing anyway. In fact, too much savings can be a bad thing, because every act of savings is an act of breaking the income and spending cycle. And you might say, well, not really, because if it gets channeled into borrowing, then it's not really the case. Well, that might be. However, there's a timing issue. If you save money and somebody I mean, what a financial intermediary does is connect somehow a borrower with a saver who don't know each other, and savings that you put on the deposit bank of America. You have no idea. I have no idea whatsoever happens to your deposit money. I don't know that you really care as long as it's there so you can get it back. But that's what a financial intermediary does, is connect borrowers and savers. And by the way, today, the whole lending complex is much more sophisticated in the sense that you've got non-bank lenders like mortgage companies that acquire funds from banks. So they're sort of secondary borrowers. I mean, the original lender is the saver, and then the bank is the lender. You got a mortgage company that borrows, and then they lend to a mortgage company, to a borrower and whatnot. So you've got this sort of disconnect that's even one more step removed. But it helps the economy to grow when there's borrowing. Yeah.
So where would credit unions be?
Well, credit unions are financial intermediaries. They're a little bit different than commercial banks because they're nonprofits. So they're a little bit different. And credit unions have got sort of an interesting history, because I think they started out primarily to serve employees of either bigger businesses or municipal workers or people who were connected somehow through work. Teachers, firefighters, union members, a lot of times were members of credit unions. Today, credit unions have sort of opened their doors to pretty much anybody, I think, for the most part. But it used to be a very private club, and it was not for profit. The great thing about credit unions was they tended to offer no cost or low cost deposit products, and pretty good rates on loans and whatnot. But they were limited to what they could do. They couldn't. They didn't typically make mortgage loans. I don't think they still make any kind of commercial loans at all. But credit unions fit in. And we're going to actually get to credit unions a bit later when we talk about the types of financial intermediaries that we are discussing here. But they would be a recipient of savings, and they would be involved in channeling people's savings to borrow. So they are a definite financial intermediary. We started to lump them together with what we call the thrift industry. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But they definitely have a role to play. So one thing about this idea of borrowing is the idea that every act of savings is a sort of disconnect between the income and spending cycle. And you might say, well, okay, yes, that's true, but what borrowing, then therefore there's no disconnect because it's getting recycled back out. You see what I'm saying? But maybe not. Maybe there's a time delay. Maybe there's a case in which people don't want to borrow and they stay away from borrowing. They don't want to buy cars, they don't want to buy houses, they don't want to put money on credit cards to go on vacation or buy furniture or whatever. So it doesn't always translate, does it? And so when we talk about a buildup in savings, what we're talking about is there's a bit of a risk if there's too much savings. And the idea is what's called the paradox of thrift. And we're going to talk more about that later. And that is the idea if we all save, and it did not get translated into borrowing, which creates demand in the economy, then we actually end up with a slowdown in the economy. It's called a paradox because it sounds like savings is a great thing, and it is, but it can also slow the economy down. And right now, the case study on that, and sorry, I spilled coffee on that, guys. It looks like a dog ran up, like ate that up, or I got run over my car or something. I hate to do it. Well, I was getting out of my car this morning, and I had a cup of coffee, and I just spilled half of it on me, and I left the coffee in the car, and I grabbed the coffee. So mornings. What's that? It's one of those mornings. Well, yeah, it's one of those mornings. Yeah, pretty much every morning's one. But so I apologize for that. That looks ratty. I apologize. So that's an issue. Now, the case study that is the sort of trial for excessive savings is that of Japan. And Japanese household is, for whatever reason, probably the fact that a lot of their capital goods are very expensive, especially real estate's extremely expensive. They're big savers, big savers. And as a result, though, that excess savings doesn't always translate into demand to borrowing. And so as a result, their economy has been sluggish for the better part of 30 years or so. And I know that in the 80s, I'm sure I'm the oldest person here, and I can remember the 1980s, where everybody talked about Japan endlessly, about the powerhouse the Japanese economy was. But then they sort of hit a brick wall around the early 90s because their savings rate was so high that it wasn't being channeled back into spending. And so their economy slowed down. So by around 2000, we were referring to what was called the lost decade. Is that when Toyota? Yeah, well, Toyota's good. Well, but Toyota's probably a more successful story than some of the other Japanese car companies. Toyota's
like a lot of their big tech-based
Yeah. Well, and it's a little bit complicated because they've got like Mitsubishi is a company that does all kinds of things. They build ships, they make cars, they make stereo equipment, they make all kinds of things. And so Sony the same way. But in terms of the consumer, they really slowed down. So what was called the lost decade is now more like 3 decades. They're only now really sort of falling out of it. So borrowing is not inherently a bad thing. And I want to make clear that it's not inherently a bad thing. I bring this up also because there's an important point that we talk about when it's something that drives economists crazy, and I'm certainly one of them. When people in politics talk about the idea of balancing the budget, and they're talking about the federal budget, and they're saying, hey, the individual American household balances their budget, why can't the government balance its budget? Well, the problem with that analogy is, number one, beyond the fact that you can't analogize and take these 3 actors in the circuit of households, governments, and business firms and say that they're the same thing, it doesn't really work at all. It just doesn't. It's like apples and oranges to compare these. And by the way, it's not even a correct statement, even by their own criteria, because their criteria is that, first of all, how does the government, we know that our federal government has for a very long time spent more than what it takes in. In other words, it's engaged in a form of dis-savings, right? And it's called being out of balance. It's a budget deficit. We're going to talk more about that. And how it funds itself is typically through borrowing, right? But this idea that somehow, even by their own criteria, that the American household balances its budget is not even true, because most households have a lot of debt, and it's not necessarily mortgage debt, which can be several $100,000, and it's nothing that's that. Nobody thinks, hey, that's a crazy thing to buy a house. I mean, obviously, we had some excesses in mortgage lending in the early part of the century, but nobody really thinks that's a crazy thing to do. So even by their own definition, it doesn't even make sense. So it really drives me crazy. And politicians have not particularly done a service, I think, to the American public in helping them to understand economics. I think they do a disservice. And this is why I think a lot of people have a difficulty with some of these analogies that are made. It doesn't really make any sense. We had a presidential candidate about 30 years ago named Ross Perot. He was a big businessman, billionaire businessman, founded electronic data systems, and said, I'm a businessman, I can get in there in the government, and I can get under the hood and start working on it. And it wasn't a very good analogy. And frankly, the presidents we've had who've been business people have not particularly been successful presidents over time. And there is just an indisputable fact.
Hasn't it been like 25 years now since we've had a surplus, a federal surplus?
Yeah, we had a surplus in the late 90s. We had about a 4-year surplus, and where the government took it more into what it spent. And a lot of that was due to the fact we were dialing down on defense spending rapidly. And the economy was growing rapidly. And so it was just a confluence of things. Some of it was demographic too, this big baby boomer bulge in the population that's was all born between 1946 and 1964 was now starting to earn more. And so they were really coming to their own around that time. So some of that was demographic, but yes, we had a surplus, and then we slipped back into deficit around 2001, and we've been in deficit ever since. But we seem to be able to handle it. I mean, I've been hearing my entire adult life about how borrowing is a bad thing. It's going to crash the economy. Government borrowing, and it really has not. We saw excesses in mortgage lending, but that was, and we're going to talk a bit about that. Your text gets into some pretty good discussion about the financial crisis that began around 2007, 2008, and it was just simply bad loans. I mean, it wasn't the fact of borrowing, it was in lending, it was the fact of bad loans. And that's, banks were losing money the old-fashioned way. They were doing knuckleheaded things with lending, and that's the issue. And we'll talk a bit more about what the causes of that were, and why it sort of brought the economy to its knees. But this is an important thing to know, this idea of borrowing. The dis-savings can be funded by drawing down on existing savings or borrowing. And there's one final thing, and we're talking about households here, and that is the receipt of transfers. And let's talk a bit about what transfers are, because we're going to sort of pick up on this a bit later in the course as we talk a bit more about government support for the economy generally. So what are transfers? Well, we define transfers in the circular flow, and I guess if I had room, I'd draw a circular flow model here, but just think about it this way, though. It's a one-way movement of money from government to households. So if you think about the circular flow model that I've drawn, where I've got red arrows representing goods and services and labor, and those real things, tangible things, and money flows green, This is just a green arrow from government to households. There's no quid pro quo. You don't have to do anything to get it. You just have to be eligible. Okay. And I realize that with some of these, like Social Security is the big one, right? That when I say you don't have to do anything, I know that's sort of fighting words to anybody who gets Social Security, but Social Security benefits are cases in which, yes, you pay in. So yes, you have to be eligible because you have to pay taxes into it, but you don't have to do anything to get it because you just have to be eligible. And by the way, if you pay Social Security taxes, which everybody who works in some fashion, and I mean, and when I say works, I mean, this is based on earned income, whether it's a job or self-employment, pay into this. It's not based on investment income or rental income. It's considered passive and it's not taxed. But everybody pay, if you work 20 years, okay, so you've worked your 10 years minimum and you have no spouse, no dependents, and you die, what happens to that money? Is it sitting in an account somewhere so that your long lost nephew from Timbuktu can grab it? No, it's gone. That money is gone. It's not a savings account. It's not a 401k, it's not an IRA, it's not a pension, it's money that's gone, it's a tax. And that's one of the controversial aspects of Social Security. And I know President Bush in 2005, I think, after he was reelected, really rejuvenated the discussion. He started in his first campaign for president, which I thought was very interesting. It freaked a lot of people out, which is, I suspect, the reason why in 2005 he was on the subject for about 2 weeks and then got off it because he thought it was too hot to handle. And it probably was. And it probably, frankly, wasn't sold very well. The idea of privatizing Social Security, or at least doing a partial privatization to let people opt in a portion. Maybe half of my taxes go to a mutual fund and the rest go to the Social Security fund. And if I do die, then somebody can grab that money and so forever. And of course, it got caught up in the whole maelstrom of all it is a reward to banks and Wall Street and all that. And of course, whenever you hear people talk about it's sort of it's just a what's the term I want? A catch-all phrase to include all financial intermediaries. I worked on Wall Street for a summer. It's not a very big place. I mean, Wall Street, you could probably hit a golf ball from one end to the other. It's not like this giant place. It's just a physical location in Lower Manhattan. But it's this euphemism for all financial companies. Yes, it probably would have helped them, but it also would have allowed people to have gotten some of their savings back. But I know it probably wasn't presented well, and I think the president at the time backed away from it. That's an example of a transfer, is a Social Security payment. Now, that's not really what's going on here, but it is a form of transfer. All I'm simply saying is the biggest transfer by far is Social Security. That's not really related to what we're talking about with regard to savings. We're saying that if somebody is spending more than what they're receiving, they could receive things like unemployment benefits. Okay, that might be one reason why people are spending more than what they're taking in, even though there are legitimate reasons why, and I've talked about the reasons why. Unemployment benefits. And by the way, when we talk about unemployment benefits, it's important to put the word unemployment benefits in there. I know that I about this for a while, and because I have a lot of online courses, or have traditionally, and during the COVID epidemic, a lot of people were getting unemployment benefits. That when I was bringing up in discussions in the online courses, unemployment, people were talking about benefits. I said, why are they talking about benefits? I think people hear the word unemployment and they're immediately thinking benefits. I was thinking of unemployment as a economic phenomenon, frictional, structural, whatnot. So when people talk about unemployment, I think so many people were getting unemployment benefits. They were just saying, I'm getting unemployment. When we talk about unemployment, here I'm saying unemployment benefits. So that's a form of transfer that can be received. Also, there are things like food assistance, housing assistance, the list goes on, including things like student assistance. So there are all kinds of assistance out there. These are forms of transfers and whatnot. And by the way, one thing that I should mention here is the idea of just savings, which is not necessarily a vice, it's maybe a virtue, if anything, is the idea that, let's say that you go to medical school or law school or whatever, you have a very large amount of debt, you save $200,000 in debt. And that would be a lot if it were on a credit card, and all it was just simply you blowing it on, vacations and dinners out and all that, and junk, I guess. But this is something that would pay off. And so let's say you become a medical doctor or a lawyer or whatever, and that $200,000 sort of shrinks in comparison as you grow your income, and so it's not that big of a deal. It's manageable. So
Since it's into savings, the rare times we have federal dividends that would be considered part of transfer.
federal, you mean like it's like stimulus, you mean, or
Like when you have a surplus spending.
Oh.
The dividends of the government.
dividends? Excuse me.
Or like, I grew up in Alaska, so they.
Oh, you're talking permanent fund.
I'm talking about both because I
Oh, yeah?
want to know about the federal dividends that they did in the 90s, if it is part of transfers or not.
I'm not familiar with the federal dividends. I'm not sure what those are.
I heard that they gave dividend checks in the late 90s.
Well, I know that we gave stimulus checks in the early 2000s and
Is that
through
what
the
it was?
2000s. That was in 2001. I think there was an early, I think it was it's called an advanced rate reduction credit. The president coming to office signed a tax cut, and rather than wait till the next year and then they file, they would get it immediately in a check up front. Okay, and then there was the next year they had something called advanced child tax credit, but not everyone had children, so if you didn't have a child, you didn't get that. And then there was one that was like in 2008 when the financial crisis was going on, and that was the stimulus, like what we have come to understand stimulus checks to be. That was just free money. You didn't have to report it. It was just, anybody could get it. Now those are the only ones that I know of.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they were called dividends necessarily. But you may be thinking of the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend.
I understand the permanent fund dividend,
Okay,
as well, but my parents told me about it, and it was like 1998.
I don't know. Maybe I don't recall that. But if you think about, if you maybe ask about it, and
Yeah.
maybe I just missed that. Maybe I slept through that at that time. The Alaska Permanent Fund is interesting. It's the only state, I think,
That has it.
not only do you not have it, there's no state income tax, right?
There's no.
No state, in fact, not only is there no state income tax, but residents get a check from the government, state government for their share of oil revenue.
Yeah, it's a 5-year oil investment, but it's like a return basically.
You have to live in the state
For a full 100.
for a year,
My only other question about, and was there an expansion of unemployment benefits in 2008?
yeah. 2008,
I remember there was a lot of
2009, yes.
There was a lot of problems with unemployment at that time.
Yes. It was, and we were in an economic downturn. There was an expansion of that. There was also a suspension of the withholding for Social Security and Medicare. And those taxes are collected together. Social Security and Medicare, sometimes they're lumped together. If you see like a paycheck, it'll sometimes say FICA, and it's simply, we usually link together Social Security and Medicare together. There are two pieces, Social Security and Medicare. And this is 6.2%, this is 1.45%. Sometimes they're just sort of joined together. That might have been expanded. I know there was a suspension of that. President Obama signed off and then said, look, we can't keep this forever because we need to be paying into it. So as a result, the idea was that it was a temporary measure, but there were some expansion of unemployment benefits. I do believe back then, and there definitely were during the pandemic. There was an extension of the period. And I think that unemployment and some of the qualifications, I think, were quite a bit relaxed, and there was just a lot of money the government was pushing out during the pandemic, which really saved us from a recession. I mean, we only had about a 2-month recession, which in some textbooks doesn't even qualify as a recession. I know that for what the economic world has sort of gotten this idea and sort of transferred it on to everyone else, that a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of downturn, but that's not what the government defines it as. They define any downturn as being negative growth, whether it's a month or 2 months or whatever. Okay, so anyway, this is the idea of this savings and savings. And one final thing about this is, and I think I might have talked about this before, it's a rather ridiculous example, it's sort of an absurd example, but when we talk about the paradox of thrift, we're saying that savings, even though it sounds like it's a great virtue, may have some drawbacks. In the sense that, let's say that we all, for whatever reason, we're all in Albuquerque living on our own sort of planet here, isolated economy. We all decide to save, and we don't spend for the entire month for whatever reason. And we're anti-business or whatever. Well, what happens is nobody buys goods, inventory sits on shelves, prices go down, practically to zero. Sellers are trying to get rid of it, but there are no buyers, and so as a result, there's a buildup of inventory, but there's also a buildup of savings, and that's an important thing to talk about. if there's a buildup of inventory, there's also a buildup of savings, and that's the problem Japan has had. The buildup of savings is matched by the fact that inventory is not moving. And as a result, the economy slows down. So if nobody's buying goods, firms lay people off. And that's what slows the economy down, is an excessive amount of savings. So that is really the issue with savings. It sounds like a good thing, but it may not be. All right, so questions about any of that? So I want to go back to this idea of mathematical complements. These have got to add up to 100%. They've got to, even if consumption is greater than disposable income, we still have a way to account for that. So it does make sense for us to be able to account for that. So I know some of this is not in your book, which is one reason why I'm going over this with probably more detail than what maybe you might have anticipated. So I want to talk about this next topic here that deals with tendencies or leanings, and we call these propensities. And the term propensity is something that applies to a number of different topics in economics. So propensity is simply a tendency. I think I got the term. I guess I should have cited my source there, since I've got a quote. So I'm guilty of plagiarism on that one word, but nonetheless, it's a leaning. It's sort of a default setting, if you like. I think it's one way to put it. And there are all kinds of default settings in the economy that sort of make actors do what they do simply because it's their natural tendency to do so. If you pull a dog's tail, the dog's probably going to bite you. Even if it's your dog or anyone else's dog, not because the dog is thinking things through and saying, hey, I didn't like that, I'm now going to bite you. It just simply is a natural reaction. So in this case, we've got a natural reaction to behave in certain ways, because I think there's a lot of evidence of the fact that households in particular, and this is really what we're talking about here, and we're taking the household model, we're going to sort of build a macro model. Beginning with the household, we're going to sort of build this into a model of the macro economy, particularly in chapter 12, as we get into the Keynesian model. And as I mentioned at the outset, and for some of you who weren't here at the beginning, we're going to cover some of Appendix B, even though it's not assigned in the readings. You can read it if you like, but I'm just going to cover some of the basics and not the full deal. But we're going to build the household model and sort of work our way up to the entire economy. So I've got something called the average propensity to consume. This is simply consumption over disposable income. We call it APC. So it's simply taking the percentage of disposable income that gets channeled to consumption, whatever that figure is. And then the mathematical complement to that is the average propensity to save, which is simply savings over disposable income. So the two have to equal one another. When I say 1.0, if you prefer percentages, you can move the decimal 2 points to the right. This is why a lot of the calculations in the textbook have these things times 100, because you're going to end up with a decimal. 1.0 is a decimal. If you simply move it 2 points to the right, you can express it as a percentage, for those who want to see it that way. Personally, I think we ought to be more comfortable with looking at decimals because it sort of better matches the sort of computers and calculators, but nonetheless, you kind of get the idea. Together, they have to equally is over 100%, and this would be negative, and it would be somehow. By the way, as to the subject of transfers, and this sort of goes back to my point earlier about why it's difficult to sort of analogize and say that all these actors are simply the same, they behave the same, they're just different, got different names, is because of the fact that let's say that we've got a very high consumption rate, very high savings rate. For whatever reason, maybe it's a high unemployment, because one thing that happens during high periods of unemployment is the fact that people draw down on their savings. To the point where maybe the savings goes away and they've got to now go to transfers until they find a job. Well, here's what government can do that households can't do, is they can create money out of thin air. And they can and do it all the time. And can't do for obvious reasons. I mean, I think it would be nice if we could do that, right? But that would sort of be against that would sort of be a sort of a side point there. I didn't swivel the camera. I'm sorry. For those of you watching on the video who are cussing me now because I didn't do that. So, propensities are the average propensity to consume, the average propensity to save. So government can create money out of thin air, and we're going to talk more about how it can do that. It can basically do a great policy function, and it's not particularly difficult for it to do. And it sounds like it's not possible. And sometimes people think, well, how can the government do that? Because it isn't money backed by the gold, by the supply of gold, and it is not. And money hasn't been backed by gold for a better part of years, in this country at least. And so we can create money without regard to gold because gold is not backing. In fact, what backs the US dollar is nothing really, except the quote unquote full faith and credit in our government. And that's really it. And this is why government's got to maintain strong credibility in economic policy in order for people to have faith in it. And there are plenty of cases where people have lost faith in governments around the world and therefore no longer want their currency, just don't want to hold it, period, right? A lot of people don't want to hold Russian rubles right now. It's probably not, you can't do much with it. There's not a great thing to hold, really.
So that we borrow and we're in deficit. We're the main country.
Well, and here's a neat trick that we run. So it's kind of the left hand borrowing from the right hand. So Congress can and the president can sign off on increases in things like benefits, tax cuts, stimulus checks, spending, all kinds of programs, running a deficit, therefore needing to borrow. And if there aren't enough private borrowers out there right now, there has not been a shortage of borrowers. There's people wanting to buy our debt for a very long time. But if not, the car fell down. The right hand borrows, the left hand can. I'm sorry, right hand borrows, the left hand can lend. Our Federal Reserve in order to do that, and that's a trick that nobody can do but governments. And by the way, this things that is a criticism of the euro is, and some economists, including Paul Krugman, have talked about the fact that some governments have found themselves hamstrung, like Greece, like Spain, because they can't borrow in their own currency. They're on the euro, and so they can't have the flexibility that they had. But remember, a few years ago, Greece was almost ready to leave the eurozone. They had one foot out the door. I mean, the president at the time and actually ordered the central bank to dig up the old printing plates or the old drachma, which is the old currency in Greece. They were pretty close to leaving the euro because of that lack of flexibility. And we could do a lot. We could do a lot on that. My point is, though, that government has a way to create these propensities that exceed 100%. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the consumption function. Okay. So we're using the term function here, so it must mean that there's a mathematical relationship, and there is. So what about the consumption function and what is it? So we're saying that consumers spend a higher percentage of a lower disposable income and a lower percentage of a higher disposable income. And I'll draw you a bit of a graph here in a minute as to what these things look like. This is not, I don't think this is really earth-shattering information to a lot of people. And it's simply, I mean, just in your own experience and your own sort of common sense knowledge of this, I think you would probably understand that high income households probably spend a lower percentage of their income simply because they have so much income that they don't have to spend all of what they earn. But a lower disposable income, that is, a lower income household spends a much higher percentage, even if that percentage is over 100%. That's very possible to do. And in fact, I think one of the things that we saw beginning around the 1980s with the explosion of credit card debt was the idea that a lot of households, not even lower income households necessarily, were engaging in spending way more than their incomes. But it wasn't on things like houses necessarily and student debt. It was on just junk from credit card spending. We saw lots and lots of credit card debt pile up during this period. And banks were lending money like crazy. And it was really the time in which banks were being very competitive with one another, and the economy was growing, so they felt like they could do that. And I can remember the days I was in banking. I know the bank I worked for. We had a bit of a shortfall. It looked like we weren't going to make our budget for the year, so we decided, hey, let's do a credit card deal. We'll just, and we'll get lots of new money on the books at very high rates. So yeah.
Was the formation of the credit system and credit scores in the 80s a result of the high inflation of the late 70s?
I don't think so. You mean the credit scoring system? I don't think so. The credit scoring system. So credit score is like what we see on TV, like Experian. What is your Experian score? What is all this? Is the last I heard, there was one company that had the monopoly on all three credit scores of all three credit bureaus. It's a company called Bear Isaac. And they just call it different things and they sell it. And credit scoring has been around before that. I think a lot of finance companies, consumer finance companies, when they used to exist, used to have their own scoring system. So it's been around for a while. First thing, I think credit scoring is I think it's got a lot of drawbacks, frankly. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a lot of the financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, was due to lenders relying too much on credit scores. I saw it so much driven by credit score. You have a 720 credit score, so therefore, okay, lend this person all what they want, without regard to the fact that maybe they have a high credit score because they just don't owe them much. Maybe they don't have very much experience with borrowing, and certainly not with big ticket borrowing. I think it was an over reliance, and I think bankers, like a lot of people, are too happy to simply latch on to one particular metric. This is a disease in finance generally, is the idea that we latch on to one thing, and we just simply say, "This is it. This is the goal, the grail." And I think that was part of it. So, okay, so the consumption function. This is not surprising, I guess, that low-income households spend a higher percentage of disposable income, and higher-income households spend a higher percentage. So, what is the complementary idea to this? Well, it's the complementary function mathematically. These two tie together, which is what we sort of put on the board here a minute ago. Households save a lower percentage of a lower disposable income, and a higher percentage of a higher disposable income, to the point where most of the savings in the country comes from higher income households. And this is not terribly surprising. And what is even more what is even less surprising is the fact that what is the trend now with regard to wealth and wealth distribution is the idea. We know that income is not equally distributed, but income is different than wealth, and a big portion of wealth. Remember, the term savings here is sort of used comprehensively to include not just bank deposit accounts or any depository institution accounts, but also things like stocks and mutual funds and bonds and investments in 401ks, which are generally invested somewhere in the financial among some financial intermediary, which is why on that definition I gave you on the whiteboard, I didn't say banks, I said financial intermediaries. It includes, investment firms, mutual funds, insurance companies, all kinds of financial investments. But what about wealth? Wealth is uneven, and wealth is becoming more uneven over time. So we know that wealth is not evenly distributed. The problem is wealth is becoming even more unevenly distributed. And this is a question that economists are I think, struggling with, and that is, how sustainable is that trend where we've got higher income people getting wealthier, and the majority of people getting not wealthy, in fact, maybe even sliding downward in terms of wealth accumulation. It's a difficult proposition. It may be in the 21st century one of the very big topics that's talked about, particularly in the industrial world, the developed world, that is what we do about income and wealth distribution, particularly wealth distribution, and what we do about it. Plus, wealthier people have access to more exotic financial products, and the money can move worldwide. And we have seen, and is certainly trying to deal with it, this idea that high-income households are also very adept at trying to move money around internationally to avoid taxes and whatnot, and all those tax havens. So it's an interesting, and it's a dilemma, but nonetheless, it is what it is for right now, and I think it's going to be one of the big issues. Okay, so let's talk about marginal propensities, and then we'll get into talking a bit about some of the main event. I'll get into some of the graphing here, and so we talked about average propensities. Well, here what we're interested in economics more is the idea of marginals. Now let's talk a bit about marginals, okay? And what do we say? We say marginals. Well, first of all, let me back up a little bit, because I skipped over deliberately the section in the text that deals with the micro piece in chapter 5. We dropped that, etc. So there are three kinds of values, numerical values in economics. I'm writing this on the board. I will swap the camera over here in a minute. There are three kinds of values in economics, and they are, first of all, totals, and averages is number 2, and the third is marginals. Okay. So totals, averages, and marginals. Now, I will come back to marginal propensity here, but what I want to do is I want to talk a bit about what this is about here, and so that we can get a better understanding of what's going on with marginals. Did I get it? There we go. I think I got the board. So, and maybe you can actually see that. I guess maybe you can't see it, but I'll turn the light on. Okay, so what are these values? And I'll specifically talk about margins. I think I need to explain this because in micro, we talk a lot about marginals and so, but micro is not a prerequisite for this class. And so I think it's probably good that we at least elaborate on what we're talking about. So totals are pretty obvious. There's nothing too magical about this. When we talk about marginals, or I'm sorry, totals, we're talking about what we call aggregates, in which this is certainly going to be one of the topics for this chapter 11 is going to be aggregates. All we're simply saying with an aggregate value is all we're doing is we're adding things up. It's all we're doing is adding things up. It's like highlighting a column in Excel and clicking the little sigma button. All we're doing is adding up totals. If I took everybody in this room and add up the age, 80 years or whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not sure it means anything. But that's how we could arrive at an aggregate age or an aggregate income. We can add all our incomes up, we get an aggregate. So that's one set of values, and we are definitely going to be getting into and using this term aggregate throughout the course, because this is one of the differentiating factors too between macro and micro, is the sense that micro deals with slices of the economy, individual pieces like markets or limited geographic areas or certain labor markets, whereas in the macro economy, we're talking about the entire collection of everything. So that's one thing. The second value is averages, and here we're talking about mean values. And by mean, I simply means the mathematical term for an average. And here there are different kinds of means. There's with the most basic form is what we call the arithmetic mean. When we simply add up, we take the aggregate divided by the number of observations, and we get a simple average. So if I take everybody in this classroom, add up our ages and divide by the number of people, there are what, 6 of us, 7 of us, and 6 of us, then I get an average age, whatever that might mean. Now, by the way, I'm going to push the average higher than what it would be if I left the room. That mean value would fall, right? Because I'm far and away the oldest person here, I believe, right? I don't think anybody would argue with that with that declaration there, right? That's part of the problem with averages too, is the sense that you get extreme values that sort of push averages to one side. And as a result, it sort of distorts valuation when we focus on averages. But here's the problem. We tend to think in terms of averages all the time. In economics and everywhere else, we tend to think of in terms of average. There's something psychological about it. And for those who are interested in behavioral economics, there is an entire body of thinking about how we tend to think in terms of averages and how when something is way out of average, it becomes difficult for us to sort of grasp. That's one. So arithmetic mean is one. There's also geometric mean, where if I give different weights to different observations, then I give a different value. If I gave twice the weight to the females in the class than to males in the classroom, then I would end up with a different geometric mean than the arithmetic mean. I don't know why I would do that. I'm just simply saying that if you give different weightings, which we do very often to different categories of observation, then you can get that. So it's totals and averages. We're not going to deal very much with averages. We're certainly going to deal with aggregates a lot. And we're going to deal with marginals. That's what we're talking about today. And here, what we're talking about is incremental values. Incrementals. In other words, this is a lot of where we sort of live in economics. And that is the idea. We're not starting at 0 every time we set out to do an observation. We're starting at some point between 0 and infinity, right? That's not very definitive, though, is it? It's somewhere between 0 and infinity. In other words, if we're talking about personal income growth, we're talking about personal income of $18 trillion. We're not saying, okay, what if personal income fell to $0 next year? It's not likely to happen. It's probably not going to happen, right? But what if it goes from 18 trillion to 18.5 trillion? That 0.5 trillion or 500 billion would be an incremental increase. That's what we're talking about in economics, is the idea of incremental changes. Increments are simply steps. That's all they are. So all we're talking about is how we move from one level to the next, whether it's incremental or marginal GDP changes, whether it's changes in personal income, changes in consumption, changes in savings. So all these are important. And so the term marginal simply refers to some sort of change from one level to the next, not usually beginning at 0 and not usually ending up at infinity. Okay, infinity itself is a problematic concept, and rarely do we really come across it in the real world. So anyway, back to the main issue here, that's the marginal propensity to consume. What is the marginal propensity to consume? It's basically saying this. First of all, it goes back to this sort of general idea that I talked about a while ago. It's the idea of why on earth do we study econ in the first place? Why are you all here at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? Well, you may be asking yourselves that anyway, but When we study economics, because it's so we can do something about economic issues, right? Like why study anything? Why study chemistry or thermodynamics? We want to do something about whatever the problem is we're facing. So in this case, we're trying to solve whatever the problem is concerning consumption and savings, the interplay between those. And so if we, in other words, change the income that households receive, and again, we're starting here with a household model. I started out this discussion by starting with GDP sort of overall and then working my way down through it all the way to the household. So we are talking about household spending when we talk about consumption. Remember, because that C is simply the C in the C plus I plus G, the expenditures model. And so we're saying, what if we change the income for some reason? Now, this would be a policy change. They might be saying, well, how do you change the income? Well, maybe the government gives a tax cut. So as a result, disposable income goes up if we give a tax cut. Or maybe we give a stimulus check, right? Now, what's interesting about stimulus checks, it sounds like, and I think that probably you could be forgiven by thinking that stimulus checks have been around for a while, and it's simply a tool of fiscal stimulus, and it's fairly new, actually. It's only been really the beginning of this century through now that we've been doing these stimulus checks. A lot of economists have been arguing for years the government should just give people money, just mail people money, and it would stimulate the economy. It turns out, wow, that does work after all, doesn't it, right? Now, maybe the government, if anything, went a little bit too far with it, which is maybe why we have some inflation. You can make that argument. I think there's something to be said for that. But nonetheless, the government can change income. So when we talk about additional dollar of income, we're saying maybe the additional dollar of income doesn't have to come from growth in the economy generally. Maybe it can come from government to stimulate the economy, to boost it, or to the other direction, take it away. Government raises taxes, it takes $1 away, or one of the number of dollars away from disposable income, if the government wanted to slow the economy down. And the problem with that is that the government tends not to want to, I'm talking about the elected side of the economy, they tend not to want to slow the economy down because it's really not what elected officials do. This is why we have an unelected central bank that will slow the economy down, which is what is going on right now, but we haven't even gotten to them yet. I talked a little bit about them. So right now, all I'm simply saying is that these dollars can be manipulated to the extent the government has the capability of creating money and whatnot. So as a result of change, so the marginal propensity to consume is simply this. What if disposable income went up by $1? How much of that would go to consumption versus how much of that would go to savings? Together, those also equal 100% because they're mathematical complements. So if I gave everybody $1,000, right, which, and when I first started teaching, that sounded like some wild fantasy, right? The government would FedEx you $1,000. Well, they've been doing that. They've given us more than $1,000, right? In fact, even New Mexico is going to probably give us some money this year, isn't that right? Where's that stand anyway? I think that it's Senate Bill 10. Somebody asked me that yesterday. I haven't been following the local news at all. So, so we may get some from the state government this year as well. So, and we got some not last year, but the last 2 years for that from the federal government. So the government can stimulate it, and some of it goes to consumption, some of it goes to savings. Okay, some of it goes to consumption, some of it goes to savings. So let's talk a bit about what this looks like here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of graph the functions here and show you what these look like. And let me see here. Did I show? I think maybe I did. Did I show these to the class here? These numerical values. They look like they're pretty visible, at least on my screen. But I don't know what everyone's seeing on the YouTube, so I will put that there for a bit. And the good thing about those who are watching it on the videos, you've got the benefit of being able to stop and whatever. And I think it's kind of a good thing. I mean, I think this is sort of it's a great innovation, at least in my opinion. So what's that? You're sick? Thank you for staying home rather than getting us home. So now you can see. So these are the three values in economics. Totals or aggregates. We're going to deal a lot more in aggregates. In fact, chapter 11 deals a lot with aggregates anyway. What we call aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We'll get to that. I mean, it seems like we're getting slowly to it, but we are getting to it. And I think this is an important groundwork to lay, particularly since where I'm working up to is something called the multiplier. Totals and averages, and then what we're talking about here with regard to marginals. Okay, so let's do this. Let me swivel the camera again to the right side of the room here, and television, as they say. So, okay. All right. So let's talk about consumption function and savings function. Okay. So what do we got going on here? So let's say we've got our friend the two-axis graph, right? And let's say we've got disposable income on both axes here. Now, by the way, in macro, we tend to do things a little bit differently than micro. In the micro model, we first dealt with, we put dollars on the vertical axis and numbers on the horizontal axis. But in macro, we can do pretty much whatever we want. We're going to put dollars on both axes. We're going to put consumption there and savings there. We have three variables, but only two axes, and so we've got to recreate the graph and duplicate the disposable income axis on both. Okay. So three variables, but two axes means we have to do a dual duplication. So what we got going on here? Well, first of all, let's talk about what we've got happening here. The graph, any quadrant of a graph, by definition, forms a 90-degree angle. Okay, so if we were to bisect that, and with an invisible line, imaginary line that cuts across here, we're saying it comes in across 45 degrees. 45-degree line is simply what we call the line of equality. And what does the line of equality mean? It simply means any value that lies on that line corresponds to equivalent values on either axis. So the coordinate points of any point that falls along this adds up to identical values on either axis because why? Because they're the same denomination. These are dollars and dollars. These are dollars, these are dollars. And so if you have a point that lies along here, and let's say that point is whatever it is. I mean, it's dollars or whatever it lies along this. If it's 100 billion here, it's 100 billion over here. Okay, that's all we're saying is the two coordinates are exactly equal to one another. So we bisect that. We talk about that's what's going on with consumption. Meaning that what? Meaning that as we get this idea going here, that we have we have this idea of equality happening. Okay, and the same goes down below, where we have the same sort of 45-degree line. Okay, and I'll leave that up there because I want to make a change here, and I want to make sure we really talk about what's going on. What is the interplay between consumption and savings? I'm sort of looking at the clock here to sort of be mindful of my time here. So I've got disposable income here, consumption here, and disposable income here, and savings here. And so what's going on is this. In both cases, in both graphs, we have this 45-degree line called the line of equality. And let's talk about what the consumption function looks like. So consumption usually starts somewhere here, right? Not at the origin, but somewhere here, and it goes up like that, and simply we call it the consumption line. It's a vertical line, it looks like that, okay? Now, it may be in real life, it may be more curvy than straight line. It may not be quite as linear. But again, there's a problem with linear expressions, and that is, or nonlinear expressions, in the sense that the math becomes a lot more complicated. And I don't want to make the math too onerous in this class. I've never wanted to do that. There is a math element involved, but I try to make this as easy to consume as possible. Okay. All right. Well, what about this issue of this difference? There's here between 0 and the origin of this value right here. And so what is that? What is the amount at 0 disposable income? We still have spending nonetheless. And so what is that? We simply refer to that value as what's called autonomous consumption. Autonomous consumption. What is autonomous consumption? It's simply this. It is the consumption that is independent of disposable income. So even if income were 0, we would still have spending. So think about this. How would one's income go to 0? Because you might lose your job, right? So therefore, if your main source of income is your job, your income goes to 0, dead, right? It just means you're not going to spend out of disposable income. You're going to be drawing upon all those things which go into drawing upon savings, right? And so as a result of this, you're going to be engaged in borrowing against something. And so, in fact, what we've got going on here is this. We've got a condition in which, right, this entire area here, you've got consumption being greater than disposable income. And so this entire area here is simply referred to as just savings. I'll put this up. I'll put this right here. So get this out of the way. That's an area of dis-savings. It's where consumption is greater than disposable income. Consumption is greater than disposable income. So that area is dis-savings. On the other hand, here where you've got income that's greater than disposable income. So income now is greater than disposable income. So now this represents savings. So as a result, you can see that savings tends to be dominated more on the higher income part of the household spectrum as opposed to the lower income part of the spectrum. In fact, it's very possible that a lot of lower income households don't have any savings at all. In fact, the evidence for that is pretty overwhelming. A lot of households have no savings. And in fact, not only do they have no savings, they have negative savings if they have any kind of borrowings at all, which is also very common. Now, that's not to be critical or to ridicule low-income households, because there are some low-income actors out there who simply have to borrow because they have no choice, right? And students, for instance, and most of us, at one time, myself included, spent more than what we took in simply because I didn't earn very much. I was a student and spent a lot because I was borrowing money to go to school. And so as a result, I was a dis-saver for a very long time. Now I'm on the other sort of spectrum. And so there's a life cycle element to this as well. And so, and there's a whole body of theory about how this whole thing works too, when a lot of, whereas younger adults have sort of a double whammy in the sense that they're starting out, their incomes are not necessarily as high. And they have one other thing that older people don't have, and that is they tend to have children, okay? And children are very, very expensive, obviously. If anybody, I don't know if anybody has kids here, I do. I can tell you that kids are very, very expensive. So that's a double whammy to a lower income household. You've got lower income and you've got high amount of spending on somebody who themselves don't create any income, right? Children tend not to support the household, and it'd be very nice to have a 5-year-old. It'd be very nice to be worked and earned income and whatnot. And I think I should put him to work doing something, raking leaves or something. But you kind of get, he's not producing income. But then again, neither did I, neither did you, and so that we get the idea, right? So that's sort of so this is really sort of an explanatory variable here as to why there is dis-savings. It does happen. There is dis-savings. Savings tends to be a feature more on the higher income spectrum. And there's also that age issue too, because as people get older, they tend to save more as they get closer to retirement. And today, some of the projections of what people would need to save for the future are just absolutely mind-boggling. I know for a lot of years it was saying you need $1 million to retire comfortably without having to pinch pennies and whatnot. Then Morgan Stanley, the investment firm, came out a few years ago and said, no, it's really $2 million because you need $1 million just for health care in case something goes wrong. And something is going to go wrong with your body as you get to a certain age. And now I heard a figure last week saying $3 million. Now, $3 million is a big number. It's a big number for a lot of people to get to. I dare say it's not going to be there for a lot of people. So these sort of tend to frustrate people when they hear these big numbers. And so, but this is why a lot of people, as they get older, do save more, even though the majority will not get to $3 million. There are places in the country where there's a lot higher savings than that, but that's not always the case. Okay, all right. So what about this condition here where I've only got about 2 or 3 minutes? Here, consumption exactly equals disposable income, right? So consumption must equal disposable income. So how do you get to a case in which this consumption equals disposable income? If disposable income equals consumption plus savings, the only case in which these would equal each other is if, right? And that value goes to 0. And so in fact, well, we can carry that value down here and say that we've got 0 savings there. And if this value here is negative savings, then we've got negative savings below the axis. And this is positive savings. We've got savings here. And so the savings function looks something like that. And the area that is this wedge here, this sort of isosceles triangle, or I guess it's maybe more a right triangle, is exactly equal to the area of that wedge there. So that's the same, so it's the same idea there. Okay, so those areas are equivalent. That's the relationship between consumption and savings from a graphical perspective. Now, what does this mean as to where we're sort of going with chapter 11? Chapter 11 deals with aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Well, we're going to get to that because I've got one more thing to talk about. That has to do with something called the multiplier. And that is, how do we push along this axis here? And then if what we're talking about is consumption, which is the element of demand, then what is the first thing we're going to talk about as we sort of push deeper into chapter 11? We're going to start to talk about demand first. And then we're going to talk about supply. And then what's really interesting about the way these chapters are organized is usually in most textbooks, we would talk about Keynes and his theory, which is a demand side theory. And then we get into aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but it's a little bit backwards, which is why I'm sort of taking this a little bit out of order. If you're wondering where the logic of this is coming from, I'm trying to sort of build the model of demand so that it ties into this model that is going to be discussed a bit more. If we don't get to it on Thursday, it's no big sin. We'll get to it on next week. But we'll definitely talk more about how we get to the model of aggregate demand. Again, one of those three values, aggregates, and we're going to take the demand side first. Okay, so questions for me about anything we talked about this morning? Okay, well, that does it. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you all.